Shakespeare's Hamlet, the greatest tragedy ever written. It tells the story of a noble prince whose father, the king, was murdered by his own brother, Hamlet's uncle Claudius. He takes the throne from his brother and even marries his brother's queen. And when Hamlet learns the truth of this, he is given a clear task: expose the crime and bring justice to his father's name. But instead of seeking justice God's way, he takes matters into his own hands. He becomes obsessed with revenge. He begins to distrust anyone and everyone around him. And eventually he spirals into madness. Along the way, he destroys nearly every relationship he has. He drives his beloved to suicide. He betrays his friends. And eventually his actions lead to the death of nearly the entire royal court, including himself. If you haven't had a chance to see Hamlet performed, I apologize for spoiling it for you. It's still worth seeing. It's still a good one. But Hamlet provides for us a portrait of an even greater tragedy that affects us all. Yes, it is a great tragedy unto itself in the technical sense of the word in drama, but it portrays for us the tragedy of the fallen human condition. Like Hamlet, we have received privileged information about the world that we live in. Scripture says God's invisible attributes have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. That privileged information we have is that this is a world that has been created by God, and a world where he has revealed himself to us, his character to us, for our good. With this bit of information, rather than use this to pursue what's right, we trade it away for lies and superstition. We do not honor God. We do not give thanks to him as God. Instead, we exchange the glories of the immortal God, of him, for lies and idols that better suit what we want. And this path that we choose, this is a path we all choose in our natural state. This path only leads to devastation, both for ourselves and those whom we love. Eventually, when we follow this path long enough, God gives us over to the lusts of our heart. And we know that God's judgment will one day soon fall on us. And the wages of our sin will be death. This is the greatest human tragedy of all. And it is even more tragic that this should describe the Jewish people, the kingdom of priests, the covenant people of God. It is tragic. It is grieving. It is so grieving, in fact, that the Apostle Paul will say, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. And here we come again to the prophet's burden in Zechariah chapter 11. Now, up to this point, in Zechariah chapters 9 and 10, the message that the prophet has delivered hasn't really seemed that burdensome. This idea of a burden is that it's a heavy, weighty message that he has been tasked to deliver. It's too difficult of a message to deliver if left to his own flesh. It's a message he would rather not give. And it hasn't, from our vantage point, seemed like it's that burdensome. We've heard of Israel's salvation. We've heard of their restoration. We've heard of their regathering back to the land. We've heard of their great king. Last week, the prophet even assured the people that they have a loving shepherd. The Lord of hosts cares for his flock. He has compassion on them. He says, I will bring them back because I have compassion on them. I will redeem them, and they shall be as though I have not rejected them. It doesn't exactly sound like a burdensome message. It sounds like a message that we would be happy to deliver. Well, here in Zechariah 11, the prophet's burden comes into full view when he declares that Israel will in fact return to a period of exile. Understand that at this time, Zechariah was speaking to people who were given the opportunity to return to the Jewish homeland. They had been exiled into Babylon, but they now have returned and they have begun the work of restoring the holy city, rebuilding the walls and rebuilding the temple. And it would seem as though the trajectory is upward. Exile is gone, judgment is over, and now let the blessings flow. And Zechariah here then, we see the burden of the message. He declares, this is but only temporary. You will, in fact, return to a period of exile. It may actually look a little different than the exile that they experienced with Babylon, but it is exile nevertheless. In verses 1 through 3, we see that he pronounces devastation. You will see over and over again, he calls out, wail, wail, mourn, all the surrounding regions of Judea. And in verses 4 through 6, he decries, Israel has become the flock doomed to slaughter. Yes, they have a good shepherd, but they are a flock, nevertheless, that is doomed to the slaughter, to be killed. The land's inhabitants will fall to foreign nations. That isn't the message that the Jewish people wanted to hear in Zechariah's day, but it is the message that he has been tasked to deliver here. How could this happen? How could the Jewish people be driven back into such an undesirable state? The answer, Zechariah declares, is that Israel will soon reject the very shepherd that was to be her Savior. He pronounces, this good shepherd that you have, you will reject him. And as the consequence of that, you will be exiled. What a difficult message to declare. For the shepherd's sake, who has done no wrong, who has been such a gracious and good shepherd, but as well such a burdensome message to declare to a people who you desire to see enjoy the blessings that God has called you to. But nevertheless, it is the burden the prophet carries. And in these verses here, we're going to see the setup in verse 4. Look at verse 4. Zechariah says, Thus says Yahweh, my God, shepherd the flock doomed to slaughter. That verb there, shepherd the flock. Understand that what he is saying to Zechariah, you might remember, was a priest. He wasn't a shepherd. He wasn't somebody that would tend to the flock on a normal basis. Not the physical animal flock. But here, God says, shepherd the flock. And what he is actually commanding Zechariah to do here is to role play the part of the shepherd. Dress yourself up in the shepherd's garb. Make your way to the field. Become a shepherd. Be a shepherd for this flock of sheep. And let your shepherding be a symbolic act that conveys my message. This is actually not uncommon. Prophets were frequently commanded to do certain things, behave in certain ways as a way to declare their message. It gets very colorful if you go to the book of Ezekiel. But God commissions his prophets sometimes not just simply to declare a message with words, but to declare it with action. And here Zechariah has been given a task. You are to become a shepherd, Zechariah, in this moment. And in doing this, you will convey a very important message. So, in verse 7, we read, So I shepherded the flock, doomed to slaughter. I put on the shepherd's garb, and I went to the flock, hence the afflicted of the flock, and I took for myself 2 staves. The one staff I called favor, and the other I called union. And so I shepherded the flock. And these shepherd staves, of course, these are used to, we've talked about this before, they're used to pull the sheep, right? Got that little hook there to pull the sheep, to protect the sheep from harm. These 2 staves ultimately would protect them from going where they're not supposed to, and maybe also protect them from predators that might come their way. In this case here, we have protection in the form of a staff symbolically named favor and a staff symbolically named union. The staff favor was to depict God's favor towards Israel, towards the flock, God's protection of them as a nation. So long as God's favor was with them, no harm could come to them. The other end is union, protection internally, protection, frankly, from themselves, unity within the nation. Remember, Israel, before the exile, had split north and south. Union was the key to their internal protection, to ensure that they did not succumb to internal bickering, fights, and basically render themselves ineffective for the work God had for them. And so Zechariah here says, I took these 2 staves, favor and union, and I shepherded the flock, just as I had been commanded to do. Verse 8, Then I annihilated the 3 shepherds in 1 month, for my soul was impatient within them, and their soul also was weary of me. I must warn you, verse 8 is one of the most debated verses in all of the Bible. Commentators note there are 40 different ways in which individuals have interpreted this verse. I'm not going to bore you with all of those different ways. Let's start backwards. These shepherds, whom Zechariah declares he annihilated, understand what he is doing here is he is speaking as Messiah in this moment. He has been tasked to be the shepherd. And so now the message that he declares is not just Zechariah, it is the message of the shepherd. It is the shepherd who declares, I annihilated the 3 shepherds. Why? Because these 3 shepherds had grown weary of me. Literally had grown nauseated with me. They couldn't stand it. That I was a shepherd like them. But Messiah declares through Zechariah, I annihilated these shepherds. What is he saying? I believe he is referring to the threefold leadership: prophet, priest, and king. Remember, the word shepherd declares leadership, a form of leadership. The prophet was a legitimate office within Israel. It was God's spokesperson as an office. But as well, you had priests, those who would intercede in behalf of the people. They were still leaders, nevertheless, and they were shepherds in their own right. Of course, king, the great protector. These three shepherds, then, are not literal three shepherds that Messiah condemns, but rather the office of prophet, priest, and king. It alludes to the fact that he was rejected as the prophet, priest, king. He was rejected as the good shepherd, as the great shepherd, the one and only prophet, priest, and king embodied in him, the Messiah. They rejected him. They grew nauseated with him. They grew weary with him. Zechariah is foretelling that this shepherd will come to you, Israel, and you will respond with great disdain. We can see this all throughout the New Testament. He came to his own, and his own people, his fellow Jews, did not receive him, John declares in his gospel. Some of his disciples turned back and no longer would walk with him. They reached a point where they said, this shepherd is just not really someone I'm interested in any longer. Some of his disciples, not the 12. The religious authorities made plans to put him to death. And of course, we know this climactically is portrayed with the crowd crying out, crucify him. Give us Barabbas, the criminal, in place of him. Let him be crucified. They rejected the shepherd, and Zechariah here declares that their very soul grew weary of me, and I was impatient with them, particularly their unbelief. My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers, Jesus declares, in frustration in the temple. Jesus, looking out perhaps over the city, he declares, O Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. But you were not willing. Here, Zechariah declares Messiah's declaration. They have rejected me, and as a consequence, therefore, I in turn destroyed those three offices for any future individual. No prophet, no priest, no king would ever arise out of that nation, Israel, that would take my place as their shepherd. At this point, we see that the flock, although they saw the shepherd with their own eyes, they did not honor him or give thanks to him. The shepherd came. He was a gracious shepherd when he came. He cared for his flock, but they only grew nauseated. Imagine a man within an inch of death due to a fatal disease, and every specialist has given up on him. But he finds just one physician, the world's most foremost expert. He offers a cure, developed even at his own expense, and offers it freely. And all the man has to do is take the medicine. This man, maybe the news makes him happy, makes him overjoyed, but then he grows tired of the physician's daily visits. The instructions are irritating. He resents the physician's medical expertise. He doubts the physician has the proper motive, and eventually the very presence of that physician is simply unbearable. He throws the cure in the trash and bars the door. And he chooses the comfort of his own disease over the cure. Of course, it's unthinkable, it's unimaginable, but this is the spiritual insanity that's being described here. When the shepherd comes, the great physician even comes to his people, offering a cure to the cancer of their own sin and anguish. And they take one look at this shepherd and they say, "You make us sick." It's tragic. Well, here, this is Act 1 of the shepherd's message. Dress like a shepherd, become a shepherd, tend to the flock. Act 1 here, the shepherd declares of the one true shepherd who tends to the sheep. But Act 2, we see that the shepherd, in Act 2, something extraordinary is about to happen. Verse 9, as a result of the people's rejection of the shepherd, verse 9, it says, "Therefore I said, I will not shepherd you. What is to die, let it die. And what is to be annihilated, let it be annihilated. And let those who remain consume one another's flesh." It's tragic. In verse 10, he says, "And I took my staff, favor." And it says, I cut it into pieces. Can I do this? There we go. "To break my covenant, which I had cut with all the peoples." So it was broken on that day, and thus the afflicted of the flock who were watching me knew that it was the word of Yahweh. Favor has been broken. God's favor is removed. The nations are no longer restrained. And it says all of the other shepherds, that is, all of those who watch the nation with disdain, ready to pounce, ready to take over, they see, yes, God's favor is no longer with the nation by virtue of the word of the Lord. And it was broken on that day, and it says the afflicted of the flock were even watching. Those, frankly, whom the shepherd had been so gracious to come after. I'm thinking of those who might have even been healed by Jesus himself. Those who were beneficiary of Jesus' ministry. Yes, even they look at this. And they had forsaken the shepherd. "And I said to them," verse 12, "If it is good in your sight, give me my wages." That is, give me my pay for the shepherding that I have done. Again, Zechariah is declaring something that took place in his day, but it symbolically represents something that will happen in the future. And so he speaks to the shepherds who are watching. He's broken his staff. What he's basically saying is, I quit. That's what you do when you're ready to leave the sheep. You just break your staff. You're saying, I no longer want to do this. But he says, pay me my wage. But if not, never mind. And so they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. Here we see the tragedy of the disdain of the people. They weighed out 30 shekels of silver. This was intended to be the price of a slave. You can go back to Exodus chapter 21, verse 32, and you can see this was the normal price of a slave. To pay 30 shekels to a shepherd was to be an insult. It's like going to a restaurant and dropping a penny for a tip. The service of untold value of shepherding is appraised at only a pittance of the lifetime service of a human slave. Eugene Merrill says, "He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Then the Lord said to me," verse 13, "throw it to the potter," that is the silver that you've received, this insult wage that you've been given. Take that insult wage, and it says, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. He's speaking sarcastically. This spectacular price, this, oh, how gracious and kind you are to pay me such a price. Throw it to the potter. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and I threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. The potter inside the temple is the idea. Throw the silver into the temple to the potter. Discard the money. Throw it in the trash. The temple has become the trash can in this moment, which actually signals God's rejection of their effort to rebuild the temple. God here says, because you have rejected my shepherd, therefore my dwelling will not be in your midst. And it's given to the potter, who is the trash collector, if you will. That word potter, it signifies exile. The one who spells your exile. Of course, it's interesting. We would see this and we would see a clear prophecy for Judas, the 30 pieces of silver, right? And it is interesting that the money that was used from Judas's betrayal was used to purchase the potter's field. And then it says, verse 14, I cut in pieces my second staff union to break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. There is to be no unity. Better yet, there is to be no unified nation with the shepherd's blessing. That is what he declares here. The brotherhood necessary for a restored nation is cut off. And here we see that the shepherd has given this rebellious flock over to their sinful desires, to God's ultimate judgment. We catch a glimpse of the fulfillment of this in 70 A.D., when we acknowledge God's judgment fell on the city of Jerusalem. The Romans breached the city walls. The temple was torn stone from stone, and many Jews were slaughtered. This is a real historical event that happened. The tragedy didn't end with just the city's destruction. Nearly 1,000 Jewish men, women, and children fled to Masada, a fortress high above the Judean wilderness. Perhaps some of you who have been to Israel had a chance to go to Masada, where they would make their final stand. Here they are in an elevated position. It's hard for the Roman legion to reach them. And in fact, the Roman legion sure did try. They laid siege for months. They even built a giant assault ramp to try to take them down. And the people said, We would rather die free than to surrender to these Romans. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. They made a pact with themselves. They agreed with themselves, a plan of action. They said, fathers, you take your families and you kill them. Kill your families. We will choose 10 men by lot who will kill the remaining fathers. And we will choose one final man who will kill those 10 men and then kill himself. They were willing to die rather than surrender. And in fact, the Romans eventually did reach Masada, and they found only silence and all of those people dead. Tragic. The Messiah's words in verse 9, "What is to die, let it die." The flock rejected their shepherd. They valued him at the price of a slave, and they followed false shepherds to their death. That's Act 2. Act 3, verse 15. "Then Yahweh said to me, take again for yourself the equipment of a foolish shepherd." Now, I'm not exactly sure what the equipment of a foolish shepherd would be. A shepherd who, frankly, isn't very good at his job. I'm not 100% sure what that equipment would be. But nevertheless, here Zechariah is commanded, you continue being a shepherd, but this time you are to be a foolish shepherd. Because, verse 16, "For behold, I am going to rise up." Listen very carefully. "I am going to rise up a shepherd in this land." This shepherd, however, is a shepherd who will not care for those who face annihilation, the sheep doomed to slaughter. I am about to raise up a shepherd who does not care at all about the flock, who seek the young, heal the broken, or sustain the one standing. Instead, this shepherd will consume the flesh of the fat sheep and tear off their hoofs. This is a worthless shepherd, a foolish shepherd. Who is this shepherd that God declares will rise up in their midst? We believe it is Antichrist, man of lawlessness, the beast. God says, "Behold the shepherd whom my people have chosen. They traded the good shepherd for a fool, for one who seeks only his own gluttony." It says he will consume the flesh of the fat of the sheep. He cares nothing for the sheep. He seeks only to destroy them. He does not defend them. There is no staff that he will use to defend them, but a sword to slay them all. Verse 17, Zechariah concludes, "Woe to the worthless shepherd who forsakes the flock. Woe to this man who is to come. A sword will be on his arm and on his right eye." I think that's referring to his strength, his arm, his right eye, his intelligence, his ability to see and perceive. He will have a mighty army, yes, and he will have clever scheming, yes, but in the end it will be rendered futile, even amidst this terrible declaration. The prophet leaves a glimmer of hope. There is a false shepherd, a worthless shepherd whom the people will wed themselves to. But this shepherd will see his end. How? We'll find that out as we keep going. The tragedy is that the flock here has exchanged the truth of the good shepherd for a false shepherd, one who gives the appearance of a shepherd, but who does not care at all for the sheep. The cuckoo bird is known to lay eggs in another bird's nest. When the other bird returns to its nest, it doesn't even know that there's a cuckoo bird egg along with its own eggs, and it will incubate that egg. And the cuckoo bird apparently hatches pretty quickly out of its egg, and when it does, its first act, even as it is blind and featherless, its first act is to shove the other eggs out of the nest. The other bird is completely unaware, doesn't even realize that the cuckoo bird is not its own. And what that bird will actually do is begin to feed that cuckoo bird. They'll pour all their energy into feeding this imposter, and it will grow large and loud and demanding, and eventually it will devour everything, even the bird that nurses it. That is the picture of the false shepherd here, the worthless shepherd. He looks the part of a shepherd, yes, but his only instinct is to consume and destroy the people of God. And the tragedy is that they, the flock, will choose to nurture the very one who will eventually annihilate them. Here, Zechariah declares what we now know. The shepherd came. He was compassionate and faithful, but he was rejected, sold for the price of a slave, thrown away like trash, abandoned for the leadership of a foolish, worthless individual. This is Israel's story. But it is our story as well, beloved. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But Yahweh has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him, the good shepherd. This is the gospel. This is the good news. God has not left us without a shepherd. Will you follow the shepherd who was rejected for your sake? Will you trust the one who bore your sin, who was pierced for your rebellion, and who now calls you by name? The flock that hears his voice, he says, I will never cast out. Today, beloved, hear his voice and come. Choose the true shepherd.